But let's start with the water rights that y'all were so eager to hear about, okay? When we're dealing with real property that has water on the property or is adjacent to water or beside water, there is a couple big pieces of language that you need to know for test taking purposes. And it really depends on the bodies of water, and it depends on a couple other things. So when we're dealing with water rights, you need to break it into two main categories. There's three down here on the bullets, but don't worry about that third one yet. Two main categories: riparian rights and littoral rights. Now, folks, let me tell you one reason why certain topics are the bane of my existence. And let me warn you of something, too. For the love of all things sacred, do not start Googling anything I'm teaching you. And this is a prime example as to why. If you were to Google riparian rights and you were to Google littoral rights, you're going to see a big old piece of overlap. They're both going to say that lakes are part of each. That is kind of a state-by-state interpretation on whether or not we look at lakes that way. Hang tight on that thought, and I'll give you a little bit of clarity, and I'll tell you, yeah, Janet, I wish, don't Google it, okay? Don't Google it, because it will make you upset. Listen, I've been teaching long enough, and I Google it to see what y'all get when y'all Google it, and I'm like, I don't like this, because it completely contradicts this. Don't Google it. Here's the way I want you to think about it. With littoral rights, I want you to think of bodies of water that have a tide. Things that are affected by the moon, not rainfall. So like oceans and intracoastal waterways. Those are the ones I want you to focus on for littoral. And I want you to basically put everything else into riparian. And I'm going to explain more why in just a second. So let's start with the riparian, okay? Rivers, lakes, streams, creeks, ponds, all of those fall into what we call riparian rights. In other words, bodies of water that may be affected by rainfall, but not the moon, right? Not gravity, not the tides, right? The ocean is on clockwork, right? High tide is this time, low tide is this time. Rivers that are connected to intercoastal waterways sometimes work that way too, but don't stress. Okay, just group all of these in riparian. And so here's the way that you've got to take riparian a step further, because these are not all the same type of body of water. And so you got to break it into two additional categories in riparian. You've got to look at it as either what we call non-navigable bodies of water versus navigable bodies of water. And folks, I want you to think about it this way, okay? I want you to think of non-navigable like your driveway, and I want you to think of navigable like the highway. Well, folks, non-navigable, let's go with your driveway. You sometimes can put a boat in a non-navigable body of water, but can we all agree that your driveway is not going anywhere? Okay, so if your driveway is non-navigable, even if you can put a boat in it, well, let me ask you this. Who owns your driveway? You. All right, so let's talk about the highway. Who owns the highway?
The state or some federal
There you go.
installation.
The government, the public, for the use of everybody. And that's exactly how these work. If you are dealing with a non-navigable body of water, you do have ownership of the water and the land beneath the water. If you are dealing with a navigable body of water, you do not own into it at all, much like the highways. And so the way that they're going to test this, more than anything, is if they say, okay, well, you've got Lot A and Lot B with a creek running between it, and it's going to ask, you know, as a creek, non-navigable, what does the ownership look like? The answer is they each own halfway into the creek. Okay, that's your half of the creek, that's your half of the creek. Now, they cannot do anything that would impede the creek flow downstream to other people who have access to that creek. But they do own halfway into the creek. They own the dirt, they own the water. Let me give you another example, folks. And I told y'all, the property I have in Georgia is a prime example. On the property I have in Georgia, I have 82 acres down in Georgia, and I have a 5-acre pond that sits slap dab in the middle of my property down in Georgia. Well, folks, that's my pond. Okay, I own it. I own the land beneath it. I own the water. It's mine. It's on my property. This is even though I can put a boat in it, it's non-navigable. It doesn't go anywhere, and I own it. So the way that they always test it is, a creek borders a property. Each would own halfway into the creek. Or a pond is bordering a property. Each would own halfway into the pond. They could build a dock on their side. They could fish on their side. Neither could do anything that's going to destroy the use for the other parties. Is everybody with me? That is your non-navigable bodies of water. When we're dealing with the navigable, folks, I want you to think of like the Cape Fear River or the Neuse River that we have in North Carolina. Have any of you ever been kayaking or tubing or anything like that on the Cape Fear? Savannah, you have? Savannah, what do you see on the sides of the river as you're floating down? Don't say trees. What do you see typically?
Like dogs?
Dogs?
Docks.
Oh,
Like,
docks. I'm like, dogs maybe. Docks? What else? What's typically with the docks?
I feel like I know this.
Houses.
Oh, yeah.
Houses.
I thought
Docks
you were
don't just...
talking in the
No. Houses. And so you see the docks, you see houses, and folks understand the way that this works. If you are floating down the river is public. You are allowed to float down there. And you're not trespassing even though you're floating through somebody's backyard. But when it is a navigable body of water, you only own up to the water's edge. You do not own into the water at all. And so if you were to get out of the river and use the restroom by this tree, you just trespassed. Because that person owns up to the water's edge. They do not own into the water. They own up to the water's edge. So when we're dealing with riparian rights, the ownership goes to where the water starts. Okay? That is the ownership. Now, to your point, Savannah, the docks. Everybody always gets very interested in docks. The docks have to have special permitting, and they are built into the public right-of-way, but they are designed for the exclusive use of that homeowner because the access to the dock starts on their property. So they do have to have special permits. That is not a public dock, even though it's built into the public right-of-way. They had to pay, they had to get it permitted, they had to do all this kind of stuff. But for navigable bodies of water, you do not own into the water. You own up to the water's edge and the water's edge only, which is why everybody can kayak, float, do whatever. Everybody with me?
That's only for non-navigable, correct?
No. This is navigable. This is riparian. So riparian, your creeks, your rivers, your streams, your, we'll say small lakes. And so let me give you all a point of clarity now. With non-navigable, you see this visual, right? You own halfway into it. And with navigable, you only own up to the water's edge. Bree says, do you have rights to the wildlife in non-navigable? You mean like fish in there? Is that what you mean?
So that's covered under North Carolina state hunting law.
Yeah, I was going to say,
By
talk to the game warden about that.
county.
Yeah.
That varies by county, so be very careful and read your contract on that.
There you go. That's right. I was gonna say that's the fish and wildlife or forestry and hunting and their division. And as Brooke said, depends. So here's the thing, folks, and this is where I want to provide some clarity. If you were to Google it, I promise you that there are going to be resources that tell you that lakes are riparian, and there's other resources that are going to tell you lakes are littoral. And the reason is there are some states that have Great Lakes. There are some states that have lakes that are kind of connected to bodies of water. There are some states that have, whatever. But I want you to think about the average lake property in North Carolina. If somebody is selling you a lake property, there's the lake, and, they're typically reasonable size. The properties are built right off. There's no beach. There's no, hangout area. Most of the time you own up to the water's edge. So in North Carolina, we treat lakes as navigable riparian. You do not own into the lake, but you own up to the lake's edge. Some states look at it differently, which is why sometimes with Great Lakes you will see resources say littoral. Don't get so caught up on it. Hopefully it will never come down to it. Just be very careful on test questions, just for the clarity there. What you got, Genesis?
So I can understand this better. I have a question. But my parents live, it's a neighborhood, it's a private community. to the left of the community, there's like a big pond behind it, but it's about 10 houses on that side, and that pond doesn't go anywhere. But on the other side of that pond, it's like a apartment complex, right? So would that be a non, or would it be I can't even think of it.
A pond is always non-navigable.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I want to know. So,
Yeah,
but
ponds are
how-
always non-navigable. Now,
how would-
do you understand, Genesis, that, going back to like Ashley's question, Ashley says, what about man-made lakes? Or, if this was a man-made pond, or if this was a pond owned by a developer, privately owned ponds, the developers, I mean, think back to the one I was talking about. If the developer buys a giant piece of property and there's a pond right here and they build houses all around it, the developer can easily write up some type of restrictive covenants that state that nobody has access to the pond, or they could say only certain people have access to it, or they could say some people own up to the edge. They can set whatever rules they want as the owner of it prior to selling off the lots.
Got you.
Yeah,
That's
so
all right.
they may have restrictive covenants that state something very clearly in that subdivision. Yeah.
If
Same thing with like the man-made lakes. Typically when those are man-made, most of the time, if they're doing them for development of residential purposes, they're going to treat them as navigable riparian, where you would own up to just the water's edge in most instances. But it would really depend on the developer and what they put into it. Way outside of the scope of what we need to focus on. The thing that you have to realize in real estate class, folks, I've got to teach you the defaults for everything. But as I've already stated, there's basically exceptions to everything, which is why I warned you there are very, very few absolutes in this real estate class. I'm not going to say there's zero, but there are very few absolutes. And so everything is negotiable, is the way we like to say it. So when we're dealing with riparian, your ponds, your creeks, your streams, your rivers, and if it is navigable, you do not own into the water. If it is non-navigable, you do own into the water. So then the other side of the equation was your littoral. Folks, not to be confused with literal, okay? It is littoral. Littoral. And I told you, littoral deals with your bodies of water with a tide. The moon and gravity goes in, goes out, every single day like clockwork. And so your oceans, your sounds, your bays. And so because we're dealing with pretty large bodies of water that are always arguably navigable, the ownership is treated differently than in riparian rights. And so if you're looking at, let's just give you an example of a beach property. If you own a property right along the beach, right here, let's say that this is your private dock, you do not own the entire beach. When we're dealing with ownership, your ownership on beachfront property goes to what we call the average high tide mark. Or in other words, the mean high tide. If you don't remember from math class, mean is just a fancy word for average. Your ownership goes to the average high tide. And that means at low tide, everything between there and there is public. We call that the foreshore. Not to be confused with for sure, it's the foreshore. Everything between the average high tide and low tide is called the foreshore, and it is available to the public. What does that mean? That means even on Emerald Isle, folks, where it's all private residences and there's no public beach access in some pockets of it, if you were to wander down there long enough at low tide, technically you're not trespassing because the beaches belong to the public. Now, do not test that theory. That is not what this class is designed to do, because some people feel quite a way that they own it regardless. And there was actually a big news story where some lady caused issues where she was freaking out, telling people they couldn't walk behind her house, even though there was clearly marked barriers stating that that was where the ownership ended. People are ridiculous. So you only own up to the average high tide mark. And then everything below that is public with your littoral rights. Bree says, but you are only not trespassing if you access from a public access point. Yes, correct. You are not allowed to walk through their yard or their private beach access. Be like, no, I'm just doing it temporarily to get down to the public. No, can't do that. You have to go through a public access and wander down in this public area, and you'd be okay. But you cannot use their access. That is theirs. That is private. What you got, Lena?
Just trying to like think of a way to remember this. If you were to say littoral rights more as like saltwater, and riparian rights more freshwater.
Yeah, of course, you know, however it helps you remember it. Of course, there's what we call brackish water, where freshwater and saltwater meet, and then, you know, so it gets a little bit more. I would just basically say, for ease, the coast should be thought of as littoral, right? Coastal areas more than anything. It's just going to be the easiest way. Don't get so caught up on it, though, but, you know, yeah, the coast and, you know, things that are affected by the moon, tides, you know, not rain, is littoral, and they're always navigable, and as such, it goes to that mean high tide mark.
Gotcha.
Yep.
If this helps, I always say like riparian like is where I find reptiles. Like I would find my frog. So like that's how I remember riparian. I'm like, okay, it's like your river, your creek, your pond is where I find my reptile, my frog.
That's pretty good. You know what? I can honestly say I've never caught a frog on the beach, so touche. Touche. The things y'all come up with. I like it. So, these are the main categories, right? Riparian and littoral. And then, of course, riparian has to be broken into those other two categories of non-navigable versus navigable. And is there going to be a crazy amount of questions here? No, but you do definitely need to know these from a vocab point of view. Folks, the last one that I said, don't worry too much about it. We don't have this in North Carolina, and so it's like I'm mentioning it in passing just in case it sneaks on the test, but it's not very common here. The third one was kind of what we call the doctrine of prior appropriation. And what that basically is, it's got two different interpretations. Number one is the first to access the water cannot be impeded upon by a later accessor. In other words, if this river was flowing and this farmer channeled water from this river to, you know, feed his farm, and then way down here along the river further, somebody else made a bigger channel, and because that was diverting so much water, it caused the river to dry up, and this person wasn't getting, they wouldn't allow that to happen. So the person who was first in access cannot be impeded by future accessors. That's one way to look at the doctrine of prior appropriation. The other way, the more simplistic way that it's sometimes articulated, is the government controls the water, even with public water sources like this. That's it. Genesis says, so whoever gets to it first, yeah. Which, I mean, at this point, all water has been accessed, really and truthfully, by now. But this is not something that I think you're even going to see on the test, because they've told us that if it doesn't apply to North Carolina, they've tried to remove it. And I know it's not on mine, but I just like to put it in passing, so if you see this term, you're not like completely just, you know, aloof. So, just a couple more pieces of vocab dealing with water. And yet again, this is just vocab, literally flashcards. You don't need examples. You don't need to fully understand it. You just got to be able to recall exactly what I'm about to tell you with these four things, okay? There are certain specific effects that water, in some instances, can have on land. The first one is accretion. And accretion, we're going to talk about credits and debits later, but the way that some people like to remember this is it's got the CRE and kind of sounds like credit, and a credit is kind of like depositing or giving something. So accretion is a gradual increase in land from a deposit of soil. So basically, water is depositing soils or dirt in different places, and that causes more land to be present because of that deposit of soil. That is called an accretion. Reliction is reducing the water, kind of like the RE there, reducing the amount of water, and that causes more land to be exposed. And so go back to a pond example, folks. If you have a 5-acre pond and you drain it, you're left with 5 acres of land. So when water disappears, it does expose more land underneath in many cases. That would be reliction. Of course, erosion, you all are familiar with that from science class in the 3rd grade. That is a gradual wearing away of soils from water flowing by. The Grand Canyon is an extreme example over millions of years, but of course, happens in a lot of different instances where properties are slowly eroded away because of lack of vegetation. You know, beaches erode all the time from things of that nature too. So erosion is gradual wearing away of soils by water. And then avulsion, think of Western North Carolina, those mudslides, those landslides, the crazy, very rapid, very sudden acts of nature that cause entire properties to be underwater or soils to disappear, or even something like a hurricane coming through and wiping out an entire beach or something like that. Yeah. That would be avulsion. Think like avalanche, okay? Kind of sounds like it. Avulsion, avalanche. Very sudden act of nature causing the removal of major amounts of soils for landslides, avalanches, hurricanes, typhoons, something like that. Couple more vocab words once you get these all squared away in your brains. These next ones are kind of a precursor, one of them at least, is kind of a precursor to our conversation with subsurface rights. Now, I will warn you yet again, these are some terms that, depending on your resource, and I think even in your textbook, it kind of groups these very similarly together. At the end of the day, they are different from a technical point of view. So the right of lateral support basically states that neighboring properties cannot do anything to destroy the structural integrity of your property. Let me give you an example of this. If you ever see like a new neighborhood being put in close to where you live, and of course they go in and they excavate all the roads and they level it out and they tear out all the trees, they very commonly will put up like silt fences and barriers along certain places. Why? Because as they're digging away all the soils and digging away all the vegetation, if they don't support it, then that could cause your property's soils to erode away, and then that would lack that structural support that you need for your lot. So this requirement to not impede the structural support of your neighboring lots is called the right of lateral support. Your neighbors cannot do anything that would destroy the structural integrity of your property. The right of subjacent support, it deals with on your property. We're going to talk about this in a second, folks. When we're dealing with things like the bundle of legal rights, and I told you could sever off your right of exclusion and your right of possession and give it to a tenant. Well, the same thing is true of things like subsurface rights. So when I say subsurface, it means in ground. Oil, gas, lithium, whatever you're looking for, resources, gold, whatever it may be underneath the ground. So you can sell off your subsurface rights to somebody else and still retain ownership of the rest of the property. But when you do that, folks, there's nothing stopping them from just putting an oil refinery in your yard the next day, because if you sell them the oil rights, they have to be able to access them. And so what the right of subjacent support says is, while they're accessing the subsurface rights that they have, they can't do it to an extent that would destroy the structural integrity of your surface of your property. In other words, they can't mine underneath your house and cause your house to fall into the ground. And then the other thing it says is when they get done, they have to try to restore it back to, the position it was in to the best of their ability. But they can still mine your yard. Bree says, do you have to consent to this? You did by selling them their subsurface rights. If you sell them to them, you've consented to it.
So in an instance where, say there's a new gas line going in and you have like a street that faces, or a house that's on Main Street or something, when they're digging up on the side of the road that impedes into your land, that is by choice. That is not like a. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Something.
The short answer is that's not by choice. Number one, there is what we call the public right-of-way, where the government always has access into a certain portion of your property in most municipalities, and there's nothing you can do about that. More than that, the government, we're going to talk about this later, has the right of eminent domain that says they can take and do whatever they want at any time. Sucks to suck, Chuck. Yeah, so there are times that they can do it without your consent. But of course, when we were, that's exactly right, Brooks. 540 is a prime example. We're going to talk about that. If you sell off your rights, you gave consent, but there are certain times where you don't have to give consent. They can just do it because. If it's for the greater good of the municipality. So, with these subsurface rights, folks, prime example here, and I'm showing my age a little bit, and some of you may get it and some of you may not. If you ever saw the hilarious show back in the day called the Beverly Hillbillies. Oof. Yeah, Brad knows what I'm talking about. Beverly gets it too. The Beverly Hillbillies, if you're not familiar with it, was absolutely hysterical. The premise was a bunch of hillbillies who lived in Texas. He was out shooting a possum or raccoon or something, and when he shot the ground, oil came out of the ground. And of course, he sold that land to an oil company for millions, what would probably be billions nowadays. And of course, they were then loaded, and so they, of course, moved to Beverly Hills 90210. And so then you got a bunch of hillbillies living in Beverly Hills, and it was hilarious. The point is, when you have things like oil, gold, and lithium underneath your property, you could choose to sell the entire property and as such, leave the subsurface rights as an appurtenance that conveys. But these subsurface rights can be severed. You could sell off just the subsurface rights and retain the property in its entirety, except for the subsurface rights. But this goes back to that appurtenance thing, folks. If I owned a property and I sold the subsurface rights to Big Oil Company 207, and then I sell the property to Page. Well, Page now owns the property, but who owns the oil rights? A lot of you are like mouthing it, but it's too oddly specific that it doesn't really work too well. Yeah, that same oil company, right? Because the lack of subsurface rights would be an appurtenance. So when I sold the property to Paige, I was selling it to her without these subsurface rights because it would be appurtenant that this company is maintaining them. Now, don't get so caught up there. You could have it structured where they were only leasing them for 5 years or 10 years, or that you got them back eventually. But if you sell them off indefinitely, when you sell the property, they would still own them, and they would continue to own them. Now, important to note, and I didn't mention this at the time, but let me circle back around to it. Things like subsurface rights, and of course the next one, air rights, can be severed from the property and sold off independently. Water rights, you can't do that because of the nature of the water being on the property indefinitely in different ways. So water rights are non-severable rights, but the rest of these are severable. So when I talk about air rights, this goes back to land. And we said when you own land, you own the earth's surface, everything above and everything below. So you do own the air above your land. Now, not to a full-fledged extent, meaning nobody can build in your airspace, but you don't own it to the extent that you can say, like, well, I don't want any planes flying over my property. You don't have that right. Okay, planes can fly over your property, drones can fly over your property. You can't stop that. And so in order to help you understand air rights, I think this is a pretty good visual just to kind of show you how this works. Folks, it's not uncommon for places at the beach to build these big high-rise hotels. And of course, to maximize their income, they will put the parking deck elsewhere where the real estate is a lot cheaper. So maybe you've got the parking deck over here. And so what they do in order to be a convenience factor is they will put a catwalk like this where you can go from the parking deck to the hotel without having to cross the street. Well, folks, these are probably public roads, which means they built into the airspace owned by the government. They probably had to pay the government and or get certain permits to do that. And so you cannot build over somebody's property that they own without paying for it and purchasing those rights. And those would be your air rights. This also comes into play with things like how high you can build a property sometimes is restricted by ordinances and municipalities and things of that nature as well. Not necessarily the same as air rights. You still own above it, but ordinances may say, well, you can't build a building more than 4 stories high or whatever it may be. But you do own into your air rights. Anthony, I'm not sure I get the reference. Like, I'm familiar. That's a movie, right?
It is. It was just basically a movie about Christina Aguilera, and she was trying to help save the club, and the guy she knew, who was a real estate agent, he was a very billionaire, and he was talking to her, and the information he basically gave her basically helped the club, and he told her about air rights. So that's why it was crazy hearing about this. So I understand what he was telling her.
Okay. See, that's a much better tie-in now, because I'm like, I don't remember that movie being set at the beach. But, all I've ever saw was previews. I never saw the movie. But now I get it. What you got, Genesis?
Okay, so on an episode, you're gonna laugh, but on an episode Selling Sunset, right?
Oh, Jesus.
I forgot what the owner, the one of the bald-headed twins. Basically, they were having a problem because the penthouse they were building was covering somebody else's view. So would that fall into the air rights or no? Because if I'm building up towards from my land, but the neighbors complaining that I just cover, you can't see the sunset.
Yeah, it would fall into air rights, because if properties had historically had a view, you building up over a certain height could impede upon somebody else's air rights. But it's partially air rights, and as I said, partially like zoning and ordinances. And so sometimes the government restricts what you can and can't build, and then other people they could sue each other in court. But yeah, it's a very oddly specific thing, and it would depend on the municipality. So, we are in this conversation of different types of appurtenances. Of course, water rights, air rights, subsurface, also called mineral, oil, and gas rights, are all some examples of different appurtenances. And so on that list of other appurtenances, we talked about restrictive covenants and fixtures. And so we're about to get into what this fixture is. And I told you, when I got into the category of, real property versus personal property, we kind of started to identify that. The reason why that's so important is because in a real estate transaction, the biggest thing is, does it come with the house or not? That is a very big consideration. And as you might imagine, there are some things that are exceptionally obvious that are not part of the house, and there are some things that arguably we're not entirely sure. And so that's where we've got to have some very detailed conversations on, is it part of the real estate or real property, or is it personal property? And the word for being part of the real property is called a fixture. In other words, it's something that is affixed to the house, and as such is part of the house. So we're going to get into that in just a second. So of course, the things that are not affixed, the things that are not part of the house, we said we refer to those as personal property. So your car, your lawnmower, your couches, your clothes, your computers, your TVs, things of that nature. All these are personal property. And so the thing that you have to understand is personal property is going to default to living with the seller. When the seller leaves, it will not be left in the house. They take it with them. And if it's real property, in other words, part of the house, it should stay for the new owner. And I told you I was going to introduce this vocab word. The word is chattel. Chattel is just a fancy word for personal property. More specifically, movable personal property. I want you to notice what I just did there. The way that people remember this is chattel sounds like cattle, and it is movable personal property. There you go. You're welcome. You'll remember that one. Okay, chattel is movable personal property. The other word that you will sometimes see is personalty. Personalty, yet again, just a crazy real estate vocab word that means personal property. And so, understand, as I mentioned a few moments ago, everything has a default setting. If it's part of the real property, it defaults to staying for the new owner in a real estate transaction. If it's personal property, it defaults to leaving with the seller. Does that statement make sense to everybody? So do you think there are ever times that maybe we negotiate that some personal property will stay for the buyer? Sure. Conversely, do you think there are ever times that we negotiate that things that may be part of the real property get to leave with the seller? Sure, it happens. And so understand that if we want it to do the default, we don't need to make a mention of these things in the contract, right? If it's real property, we don't need to talk about it because it's going to stay. And if it's personal property, we don't need to talk about it because it's going to go. But if we want it to do the opposite of the default, we have to name it in the contract. So let me give you a prime example, folks. In North Carolina, now the specifics are not going to be that testable, but this is just to give you an example. In North Carolina, a refrigerator is considered personal property. Okay? Refrigerators, washers, and dryers, they are not considered fixtures in North Carolina. They're not part of the real property. They are personal property that the seller can take with them by default. But refrigerators, washers, and dryers are very commonly negotiated items. And so if the buyer wants the refrigerator, the washer, the dryer, we have to go in and specifically name it because it defaults to leaving with the seller. So if we want it, we have to name it and say, hey, yes, we know this is personal property, but we would request that the seller leaves it for the buyer. And if they agree to it in the contract, they have to do it. So we only talk about these things if we want them to do the opposite of the default, the opposite of what they're supposed to do. So personal property defaults to leaving with the seller, and if and only if we are negotiating it to stay for the buyer, would we mention it in the contract? Otherwise, whatever. And so I keep using the word fixture, and it's very easy to remember what a fixture is by thinking about a light fixture. It's attached. And so a fixture by definition is something that was personal property, but it has now been affixed to the property itself and is now considered part of the property. Let me give you a prime example, folks. If I was to go to the Bougie Light store, okay, that's the name of it. I don't know if y'all have a Bougie Light store like up the road. That's where I shop for all my light fixtures. Okay, it's called the Bougie Light store. All right. If I was to go to the Bougie Light store and pick out this chandelier that you see on my slides, and I was to buy it in all its 10 million pieces, and I was to put it in the back of my truck, well, all 10 million pieces in the back of my truck, that are personal property. That's my box full of light fixture crap. But when I get to the house and I or an electrician installs it, permanently attaches it to the house, then we're dealing with it converting to a fixture. And now it's part of the real property, and it defaults to staying with the home. So when I go to sell it, the next buyer is going to default to getting this. Now, yet again, I told you, we can always do the opposite. Could I put it in a negotiation that I would like to take this with me? Sure, I could. But if I don't, then it's going to default to staying. Now, for the sake of this class, folks, just the sake of this class, the general rule of thumb for a fixture, or it being part of the real property, is if it's nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, it's probably a fixture. Okay, nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, it's probably a fixture. Did that answer your question, Beverly, or did you just put your hand down?
No, I got burned really bad about fixtures when we sold one of our houses, and I did not realize that. So, like, I had all this custom stuff, and, you know, I guess the smarter thing to do would have been to take it all down when we were showing, and then it wouldn't even have been a point, you know, to even have to negotiate later. But I didn't realize that, so all my little Restoration Hardware stuff ended up having to stay.
Yeah, and this is single-handedly one of the most important jobs for us as real estate brokers, to have very detailed conversations with sellers of, hey, is there anything that you don't want to stay that is on this list that typically would stay, so we can have some conversations and make sure you don't get screwed? And if your agent didn't do that, then
Yeah.
yeah, one of those things. Sergio says, we used to tell customers that all the time that we installed custom theater rooms. Yeah, right. You used to tell them when you install the custom theater rooms in the home. That's exactly right. Because, you know, once it's installed, it's typically there. Bree says, is this taken into account when the home is appraised? Short answer, yes. Not that appraisers are really giving crazy amounts of value to one chandelier or anything like that, but these things are taken into account. So there's some vocab words for what I just explained to you, right? When you take personal property and you attach it to the house and it becomes a fixture, part of the real property, the word for that is annexation. Okay? Annexation. It is where you take what is personal property, this thing, and you attach it to the house, and now it becomes part of the real property. It's called annexation. Well, I also told you that you could potentially negotiate taking that chandelier with you. And as long as the buyer and the seller agree that the seller can take it with them, and going back to Beverly's point of view, if we had negotiated that Beverly got to take all of her custom woodwork or whatever it was, then she would have been legally allowed to take it. But if that doesn't happen, then technically it belongs to the new owner. And so the term for removing it and taking it with you is severance. In other words, turning it back to personal property so that you can remove it and take it with you. Now, severance, folks, you know, the root word is not several, it's sever, to sever, right? To remove something from, sever. And so if you sever it from the property, as morbid as it sounds, if you were to sever your hand off your arm, it's not attached anymore, right? That's the root word, okay, sever. Now, as I said, we can't get too specific on fixtures versus personal property in this class. Why? Because all states kind of look at things a little bit differently. And so, yeah, for the sake of this class, the generic rule of thumb is if it's nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, it's a fixture. In the real world, we have a list. Because sometimes we need a little more clarity than that in the real world. And so here is an example. Now this is, I don't think, the most up-to-date version. We're going to look at the most up-to-date version later, but here's an example of the list that's on both the listing agreement in North Carolina and our offer to purchase and contract in North Carolina. And what it basically says is, well, hey, Slick, if there's anything on this list that exists in your property at the time of the showing, it's considered a fixture, and it's supposed to stay for the new buyer, unless you negotiate that you can take it in the contract. There's a line that says, we're going to exclude this, and if all parties agree, you can take it with you. And so alarm systems and doorbells and security cameras and floor coverings and attached basketball goals and workout equipment and swimming pools and spas and hot tubs and fencing and garage door openers, just to name a few. A lot of things. So you don't need to focus on this list right now. We will kind of look at this list a little more in depth in later sections. But generalization for this class, nailed, screwed, glued, or buried, it's a fixture. Of course, oddly specific things in the real world. It's not the nailed, screwed, glued, or buried doesn't really work in the real world. So let's take it a step further. It's actually named on this list. If you look right here, and this is, like I said, an older version, landscape and outdoor trees and plants except in movable containers. And so when I say buried, I'm talking about plants. Hopefully I'm not talking about dead bodies in the backyard. Probably should take those with you in case you don't want to get caught. Just kidding. Some of you watch too many serial killer shows. So the fructus naturalis translates to fruits of the soil. They are fixtures. Your oak tree, your pine tree, your rose bushes, your azalea bushes, your, whatever you've got planted in the yard are part of the fixtures. That goes back to the buried. No, you cannot dig up your pine tree and take it with you. No, you cannot dig up your azaleas and take it with you unless all parties agree to it. Otherwise, it stays. It's a fixture. It's buried. It's in the ground. What you got, Brooks?
So this is actually kind of interesting to me. I used to work for a rose garden installation company, and we had to, on multiple occasions, dig up an entire rose garden and move it to a new house. So it's actually more common than you might might think when that happens.
I would say
Very common.
it's probably pretty common for a rose installation company. But for the vast majority of the world, like, it's such a rare thing. But I have heard about it in real estate as well, because, I mean, if you are very big into flowers and you spend a lot of money to have a rose garden installed, that is something that is very typically negotiated. Now, in the real world, Brooks, what we do, if I was that agent and my sellers are like, I've got to take my roses with me, I say, okay, what are you going to plant in its place? Because you're not going to leave just giant gaping holes in the front yard when you dig up your rose bushes. So you're going to be buying them other plants and putting them in the ground, whatever that may be. So, but I have heard of it. It is a thing. I know. It happens. So anything that is just your everyday plants, and we're not getting into like the actual like botany side of things, where we're talking about like annuals versus perennials, just plants that you have, trees that you have, those are considered real property. They're part of the property. Okay, they're fixtures. But when we deal with what we call fructus industrialis, in other words, fruits of industry, crops, things that have to be harvested, those are considered personal property. Okay? The other word for them is implements, that word you see in bold on the slides. And so let me give you a prime example, folks. Let's go back to, and I told you I'm going to use this example a lot. It just makes my life easier. In Georgia, where I have that property, folks, I have 22 acres of farmland on that property. I don't know if y'all can tell this by looking at me. I'm not a farmer, okay? I'm not. Sergio, why are you agreeing with that, sir? He's like, I can tell that, Seth. Absolutely not a farmer. Like, Sergio, no hesitation. He's like, this man is not a farmer. I got clean nails and everything. I do, Sergio. Don't come at me like that. Okay? Listen, I'm not a farmer, so here's the point that I'm getting at. I lease that farmland out to a farmer, and he grows stuff on those crops. And so every single time I go down to that property, there's something else planted there. Corn and soybeans, cotton, and all kinds of different things. And even though I own the land, I can't just go and steal onions and potatoes and soybeans. That's not mine. That's his personal property. So that's what we mean by fructus industrialis. Even though it is somebody else's, on somebody else's property, because they have the right to farm it, you can't do anything to impede their access to it. Even to the extent that if I sold the property, including that farmland, if there was an active crop on it, the new owner couldn't do anything until he harvested that crop. That's his personal property. That's what we're getting at there. So, going back to some of the conversations y'all have had, like Beverly's scenario and some of the things I've told you, folks, this is a very big part of our job, as I mentioned, in trying to identify what's real property and what's not. And while some things are obvious, and even though we have a list, we can all agree that that list is probably not comprehensive. There are things that are going to be present in properties that are not going to be on that list. And so if there's ever something where we do not clearly figure out between the buyer and the seller whether something is a fixture or not, they typically get mad at each other and they take each other to court. Folks, any day that your clients are going to court, it's a bad day. Okay, it means you done messed up, Ron. And so hopefully we've really tried to avoid that from happening. But if it does happen, that's when the total circumstance test comes into play. Now, I want you to understand, the total circumstance test is testable, but it is a legal test applied by the courts. This is Judge Judy. It's not the buyer and the seller. This is not us as real estate agents. We've already messed up if this is coming into play. And I'll give you a prime example of this in just a second. And so what this test is where the courts look at 4 criteria. And they use these 4 criteria to decide, in their opinion, was this item considered a fixture, or was it considered personal property? In other words, did the seller have to leave it, or were they able to take it with them? And so the acronym for the total circumstance test is IRMA. IRMA. And IRMA stands for intent of the annexor. Okay, that word annexation is to attach it. So what was the intention of the person who attached it? Did they intend for it to stay permanently? Did they intend for it to come down easily? What was their intention, does it seem? R is relationship. So relationship of the annexor. Was it an owner who installed it, or was it a tenant? Folks, if you're renting a property and you go to Home Depot and you buy this really awesome ceiling fan with like Bluetooth speakers in it and stuff, and for like $600, and you go home and you put it in your master bedroom in a home that you're renting, did you probably intend to leave that $600 fan in the home that you are renting when you leave? Probably not. You probably have the other one in the attic somewhere waiting to replace it whenever you move out, right? And so, was it an owner that installed it? Was it a tenant? M is method of attachment. How permanent is it? Is it hanging on a nail? Is there 600 lag bolts? Is there 20 screws? Is it buried? Is it cemented? Would removing it cause damage? And of course, the last one is adaptation to the real estate. How customized is it to the property? In other words, if you were to remove it, is the property going to feel weird? Is there going to be a gaping hole? Is there going to be something off about it? And these are the 4 criteria that they look at. And these are the only criteria they consider. And then they will make a decision. So, true story, the list that I showed you just a few slides ago that had all those different items on it, that was an older version. Last year, there was a new item added to that list. And it was exercise/workout equipment attached. Why was that added in? Because this exact thing happened 2 years ago in a real estate transaction in North Carolina. Seller had CrossFit equipment in the gym that was bolted to the walls, where you can like lift it up and put it down like the squat rack and everything. And they removed it prior to closing. And the buyer said, no, that's a fixture that has to stay. The seller says, absolutely not. That's personal property. I got to take it. So the buyers took the sellers to court saying, no, you have to leave that. And the court sided with the buyer. They said it was permanently attached. It was bolted to the way that it seemed like it was going to stay there forever. The owner attached it, and it was, something that they determined should have stayed. And so I don't remember if the outcome was they had to pay them for it, if they had to put it back, but they added that into the contract because the courts decided, yep, that's a fixture. So IRMA is the total circumstance test for the courts. Judge Judy gets to decide this, not us. Also, as a point of clarity, there are 3 things they never consider. They never consider location, value, or size. Those are irrelevant. Doesn't matter that you spent $10,000 on that chandelier. If it was attached, it was attached. Okay? They do not care about location, value, or size.